It was an evening in late September, and the air in Columbus, Ohio carried that faint chill hinting at fall. In the Carter household, though, the temperature had been dropping for months. Megan stood at the kitchen sink, scraping mashed potatoes into the trash, her eyes drifting toward the living room. The television was on, tuned to a baseball game Daniel had been half-watching for the past hour. She couldn't remember the last time they'd sat together without some kind of screen between them. The clink of ceramic as she stacked the plates in the dishwasher felt louder than it should, filling the silence between the announcer's voice and the occasional crack of a bat. She caught herself thinking, not for the first time, that they'd somehow become two people living parallel lives under the same roof. She could see the back of Daniel's head, his shoulders slouched, one hand scrolling through his phone during commercial breaks. Years ago, she would have joined him on the couch, maybe teased him about rooting for the losing team. Now she just stood there, jaw tight, the words, "Must be nice to relax while I clean up," sitting bitterly on her tongue. Instead of saying it, she let out a pointed sigh. He didn't turn around. Megan told herself these little jabs were just her way of getting his attention, but she knew they weren't working. Over the past year, her comments had grown sharper, wrapped in sarcasm instead of warmth. "Guess I'll handle everything," she'd say when he forgot to take out the trash. "Maybe next week you'll have time to fix that leak," when the faucet dripped for days. She wasn't yelling, but she wasn't inviting conversation either. Daniel, for his part, had learned the safest way to avoid a fight was to stay quiet. And in his silence, Megan felt more invisible. Dinner had been no different that night. They'd eaten in near silence, conversation limited to "pass the salt" and "do you want more green beans?" By the time Megan carried the plates to the sink, Daniel was already sinking into the couch cushions. She didn't have the energy to push for more, not tonight. But each unspoken frustration added another brick to the wall between them. As she rinsed the last plate, she caught her reflection in the window above the sink. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Small frictions had become the norm. Megan's sigh when she saw the sink full of dishes after work, Daniel scrolling through his phone during dinner. If he made a joke, she'd point out the flaw. If she needed something done, his distracted, "I'll get to it" rarely materialized. Every interaction felt functional, transactional even. "Do we have milk?" The electric bill came. The warmth, the curiosity, the "how was your day?" that once anchored them had been replaced by clipped updates and long pauses. From the outside, they were just another busy couple caught in the grind. But disconnection, left alone, makes small irritations feel like personal betrayals. A dirty coffee mug left in the living room wasn't just laziness. To Megan, it was proof Daniel didn't care about her workload. Megan was helping by pointing out what wasn't working. But people rarely feel motivated by a running list of shortcomings. What they hear is, "You're failing," even if that's not the intent. The more Daniel heard that, the less he tried. He wasn't indifferent. He was avoiding the risk of making it worse. But what was really happening was the slow erosion of connection. That's how most marriages drift, not with one big fight, but with dozens of tiny moments where someone reaches out and doesn't get a response that bridges the gap. Standing in that kitchen, she still believed the problem was Daniel's indifference. She thought she'd already tried everything. It's easier to point the finger outward than to ask, "What am I contributing to this?" Daniel had his own quiet frustrations. He missed the days Megan laughed at his bad puns or asked about his softball games. Lately, it felt like no matter what he did, working late to cover extra expenses, fixing the fence on his day off, it went unnoticed or was met with "about time," so he pulled back. He told himself it was keeping the peace, but peace built on avoidance is only a truce. That night, when the game ended, Daniel clicked off the television and headed upstairs without a word. Megan stayed in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She could hear drawers opening and closing upstairs. Part of her wanted to follow him, to start a conversation, to break the pattern. Another part told her it would only lead to another tense exchange, another night going to bed back to back in silence. So she stayed put. And just like that, another small brick was added to the wall. Neither of them noticed the moment, but both felt its weight. They'd call it just one of those days, but it was becoming the story of their marriage. If Megan could have stepped outside herself, she might have noticed her tone with Daniel was different from her tone with friends or coworkers. She might have seen that her sighs, her side comments, her rolling eyes were all forms of communication, just not the kind that drew someone closer. She might have recognized that her feeling unseen was mirrored by Daniel's feeling unappreciated. But when you're in it, you rarely see the pattern. You just feel the distance growing and assume it's the other person's job to close it. All she could see was the space between them, and all she could feel was the weight of what went unsaid, setting the stage for the night it would all spill over. It was the end of a long week, the kind where every day felt heavier than the one before. Friday night usually carried at least the promise of unwinding together, but Megan was in the middle of folding laundry when Daniel walked into the bedroom, tossing his work jacket onto the chair in the corner. "I'm going out with the guys from work tonight," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket like he'd already checked out of the conversation. Megan looked up from a half-folded sweatshirt. "Oh, that's nice," she said, her tone tight but aiming for casual. The pause that followed stretched uncomfortably, so she added, "Sure, why not? You practically live with them anyway." She meant it to sound light, maybe even teasing, but the words landed with a dull thud between them. Daniel's head snapped up. "What's that supposed to mean?" His voice was sharper than she expected. "You know what it means," she said, turning back to the laundry. "You spend more time with them than with me lately." He laughed once, without humor. "You're impossible to please, Megan. If I stay home, you're irritated. If I go out, you're irritated. What exactly do you want?" Her chest tightened. Daniel's face hardened. He grabbed his keys from the dresser without another word. The front door slammed a moment later, the sound echoing through the house like an exclamation point to the argument. Megan stood in the bedroom, the quiet settling in. She wanted to be angry at him for walking out, but the sting of her own words hit her harder. She sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the crumpled laundry in her lap. It wasn't just that he was going out. It was the feeling that she had somehow slipped down his list of priorities. That somewhere between work, bills, and daily routines, she'd stopped being someone he looked forward to coming home to. She got up, pacing the room. The anger came first, fueling her steps. He shouldn't get to leave like that. He shouldn't get to ignore her feelings. But then, like a tide pulling back, the fear crept in. What if this was just how it was now? What if the space between them was only going to widen? Without thinking, she picked up her phone and called Kelly, her closest friend since college. Kelly answered on the second ring. "Hey, what's up?" Megan tried to keep her voice steady. "Daniel's going out with his coworkers again. We got into it. I might have said some things." Kelly didn't miss a beat. "You sound more like roommates than a married couple." The words hit harder than Megan expected. "That's not." She started to protest, but her voice faltered. She hated how quickly her mind began turning them over, more like roommates. She wanted to argue, to explain that they were just going through a rough patch, but the truth was, she didn't know if that was all it was. Kelly sighed on the other end. "Look, I'm not saying you don't love each other. I'm saying it sounds like you're both in survival mode. You've got to figure out if you're okay living like this." After they hung up, Megan sat on the bed, the glow of her phone screen lighting her face. She opened her browser without really thinking about it and typed, "Signs your marriage is over." The search results came up fast. Articles with headlines like 10 warning signs you're headed for divorce and when it's time to walk away. She scrolled, scanning phrases, emotional distance, constant criticism, lack of intimacy. Her stomach sank. She could check too many of those boxes. But she wasn't ready for divorce. The thought of separating their lives, of splitting furniture, of telling friends and family, of explaining it to her parents, was overwhelming. Still, she couldn't picture another decade of evenings like this, of conversations reduced to logistics and digs wrapped in sarcasm. She set the phone down, staring at the ceiling. Something had to give. She didn't know exactly what yet, but she knew it had to start with her deciding she couldn't keep doing what she'd been doing. People often think they're fighting about the surface issue, whether he is going out or staying in, but it's rarely about that. What was really happening here was two people trying to be heard and missing each other entirely. Megan's comment about Daniel practically living with his coworkers wasn't just a jab. It was a clumsy way of saying, "I miss you." Sarcasm is often the wrapping paper for a much softer truth. But the problem is that sarcasm feels like an attack to the person on the receiving end. Daniel's response, "You're impossible to please," wasn't about defending his choice to go out. It was the quiet frustration of feeling like he couldn't win with her. No matter what he did, it wasn't enough. And when both people are wearing masks, one made of sarcasm, the other of defensiveness, it's almost impossible to see the real emotions underneath. In healthy communication, there's a pause where empathy has a chance to step in, where one partner can think, "Why did they say that? What are they really feeling?" But when emotions are running high, the pause vanishes, and what's left is a volley of hurtful lines. The irony is that these defensive moves usually create the very thing both people are trying to avoid, more distance. If Megan had paused, she might have said, "I wish we had more time together," which could have opened the door to an honest conversation. If Daniel had paused, he might have said, "I want to go out tonight, but I get the sense you're upset. What's going on?" Those aren't easy things to say in the heat of the moment, but they shift the interaction from attack to connection. That night, though, neither of them found the pause. Megan sat alone in the bedroom, listening to the occasional car pass outside, wondering if Daniel was even thinking about their fight. She imagined him laughing with his coworkers, drinking a beer, not worrying about how she was feeling. The image stung more than she wanted to admit. When Daniel finally came home, long after midnight, Megan was still awake but pretended to be asleep. She heard him moving quietly through the dark, setting his keys down, slipping into bed without a word. His back was to her, and she stayed perfectly still, even though her mind was anything but. This wasn't the first time they'd ended the day without speaking, but tonight it felt heavier, as if something had shifted. She lay there, staring into the dark, her mind replaying their words, the casual cruelty in hers, the sharp edge in his, the sound of the front door slamming. More like roommates than a married couple. She didn't want to believe it, but the words kept echoing. She decided she couldn't just hope things would improve on their own. Hope without action was just waiting, and she'd already waited long enough. Megan didn't know yet what she was going to do differently. She just knew she was done repeating the same cycle and expecting a new outcome. And that small, private decision was the first crack in the pattern that had been holding them both in place for far too long. The next morning, Megan woke up earlier than usual, her head still heavy from the tension of the night before. Daniel was already gone, his truck missing from the driveway when she looked out the window. She wasn't sure if he'd gone to work early or just wanted to avoid another awkward breakfast. The air in the house felt stale, as if it had absorbed their silence. She decided she couldn't sit in it another minute. She threw on jeans and a sweater, grabbed her keys, and drove to her favorite coffee shop downtown. It was the kind of place with scuffed wooden floors, chalkboard menus, and a constant hum of conversation. The baristas knew her order by heart, a medium latte with oat milk. She found a corner seat and pulled out her phone, trying to distract herself with the news, but her attention was pulled to the two women at the table next to her. They looked to be in their late 30s, both with oversized mugs in front of them and the kind of familiarity in their conversation that only comes from years of friendship. One of them was saying, "I just tell him what I'd love instead of what he's doing wrong." Megan's eyes flicked up from her phone. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the sentence landed in her mind like a pebble dropped into still water. She leaned back slightly, as if making herself more available to catch the rest of the conversation. The second woman laughed. "So you don't just say, 'You never help around the house?'" "Exactly," the first said. "I'll say, 'I'd love it if we could tackle the dishes together after dinner so we can sit down sooner.' It's different. He doesn't get defensive, and 9 times out of 10, he actually does it." Megan felt a small, uncomfortable twist in her stomach. This was the opposite of how she usually handled things with Daniel. She thought about the last time she'd said something genuinely appreciative to him, without a hint of criticism tucked inside. Nothing came to mind. She could recall plenty of sighs, sarcastic remarks, and "I guess I'll do it" moments, but not much else. The women went on, trading examples, phrases they'd used that got better results. Instead of saying, "You're late again," I'll say, "I'd love to eat together while the food's still warm." Or, rather than telling him he loads the dishwasher wrong, I'll say, "I'd love it if the cups go on the top rack." Megan smirked at that one, knowing she'd been guilty of correcting Daniel's dishwasher technique more than once. Before she could second-guess herself, she leaned toward their table. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice tentative. "I couldn't help overhearing. That thing you said about telling him what you'd love instead of what he's doing wrong, that's interesting." Both women smiled, the way people do when they've been caught mid-conversation, but don't mind the intrusion. "It works," the first woman said. "I mean, not every time, but a lot more than when I used to point out everything he wasn't doing." The second woman nodded. "It's not about pretending everything's perfect. It's just, men want to feel like they're winning with you. If they think they can't win, they stop trying." Megan tilted her head. "Winning? Like it's a game?" "But not like a competition," the first clarified. "More like, they want to feel successful at making you happy. If you're always pointing out what they missed, it's like moving the goalposts every time they get close." Megan let that sink in. She thought of the times Daniel had fixed something around the house and she'd pointed out what he hadn't fixed yet. Or when he'd made dinner and she'd mentioned the mess he left behind. In her mind, she'd just been covering all the bases. But maybe to him it had felt like nothing was ever enough. They swapped a few more examples, and Megan found herself laughing at some of their stories. The botched attempts at DIY repairs, the burnt dinners, the little misunderstandings that somehow turned into inside jokes instead of arguments. There was an ease to the way they talked about their husbands, a gentleness she realized had been missing from her own tone for a long time. The first woman finished her coffee and stood to leave, tossing her paper cup into the bin. "Anyway," she said to Megan, "try it. Next time you want to point out something he's not doing, see if you can turn it into something you'd love instead. It feels weird at first, but it changes the whole vibe." The second woman added, "Men want to make their wives happy. It's just hard for them to do that when they feel like they can't win." She said it so simply, like it was obvious. But to Megan, it was the kind of sentence that lingered long after the conversation ended. When they left, Megan stayed in her seat, staring at the swirl of foam in her latte. She thought about Daniel, not the distant, irritated version she'd been living with lately, but the guy she'd married. The one who used to surprise her with her favorite candy just because, or fix something on her car before she even knew it needed fixing. He hadn't always been so withdrawn. And maybe, just maybe, her constant corrections had something to do with that. Here's the thing. Most people shut down because they feel like they can't get it right. When someone senses constant disapproval, whether in words, tone, or even body language, it's like walking through a minefield. For men especially, there's a deep drive to please the woman they love, but that drive runs on the fuel of appreciation. Without it, the engine sputters. Megan wasn't naive. She knew Daniel had his part in their dynamic, but sitting there, she began to see her own role more clearly. She'd been micromanaging without even realizing it, correcting, suggesting, just pointing out things constantly. She thought she was helping, but what she was really doing was draining the very motivation she wished he had more of. She took a slow sip of her latte, her mind turning over the examples the women had given. "I'd love it if..." How different that sounded from, "you need to..." It wasn't about sugarcoating or avoiding problems. It was about framing them in a way that invited cooperation instead of resistance. And maybe, she thought, it wasn't just about the words. It was about the energy behind them. When she spoke to Daniel lately, it was often from an energy of frustration, sometimes even resentment. What if she tried approaching him from an energy of curiosity or gratitude instead? The idea felt awkward, but what was the alternative? More of the same arguments, the same slammed doors, the same nights lying awake wondering if they were going to make it. She glanced out the coffee shop window. Daniel would be home late tonight. He'd mentioned something about a meeting. Part of her wanted to test this new approach right away, but another part of her was nervous. What if he didn't notice? What if it didn't work? Still, she knew one thing for certain. If she kept doing what she'd been doing, nothing would change. And after last night, change wasn't optional anymore. It was survival. She finished her coffee, gathered her things, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The street smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery down the block, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of something other than frustration, a kind of cautious hope. Sometimes, the biggest shifts start in the smallest moments. A sentence overheard, a conversation with strangers. Megan didn't know yet how this one would play out, but as she walked toward her car, the line repeated in her head like a quiet drumbeat. Men want to make their wives happy. It's just hard for them to do that when they feel like they can't win. That evening, Megan stood at the kitchen counter slicing tomatoes for a salad. She could hear the faint sound of Daniel's boots on the living room floor as he moved toward the couch. This was usually the point in the evening where she'd glance over, see him sit down, and feel the familiar irritation creep in. Here we go again. Me in the kitchen, him doing nothing. But she caught herself. The words she'd overheard at the coffee shop that morning were still fresh in her mind. I'd love it if we could tackle the dishes together. She took a slow breath, set the knife down, and called out, Hey, I'd love a hand setting the table so we can eat sooner. Phew. There was a short pause, as if Daniel wasn't sure he'd heard her right. Then, from the living room, sure, he got up, wandered into the kitchen, and opened the cabinet for the plates. It wasn't a grand gesture, but Megan noticed the difference immediately. He didn't sigh, didn't shuffle like he was being dragged into a chore. He just did it. She glanced over, saw him placing the silverware, and for a moment she felt almost thrown off balance. She wasn't used to making a request without layering it in frustration, and she wasn't used to seeing him respond without hesitation. At the table, he cracked a joke about the fancy paper napkins she'd used, and she found herself laughing, genuinely, not out of politeness. It felt strange, like she'd just stumbled into a different version of their evening. Still, the change felt awkward. As they cleared the dishes later, Megan kept wondering if Daniel could tell she was trying something new. Was it obvious? Did it seem fake? But he didn't say anything, and the night passed without the usual low-grade tension humming under the surface. Over the next few days, she decided to keep experimenting. When Daniel mowed the lawn Saturday morning, she didn't point out the spots he'd missed near the fence. Instead, she brought him a glass of water and said, "Thanks for taking care of that. It looks great out there." He looked at her for a moment, almost like he was checking to see if she was joking, then nodded. Sure. When she needed help with the groceries, she tried, "I'd love some muscle bringing these bags in," and he appeared in the doorway within seconds. And when she saw him folding laundry, something she usually corrected because he didn't do the towels right, she bit her tongue. It wasn't easy. The urge to fix it was strong, but she told herself the extra folds didn't matter nearly as much as him doing it without her asking. These were tiny shifts, almost invisible if you weren't looking for them. But Megan noticed something. Daniel seemed more relaxed around her. He lingered in the kitchen when she was cooking, asked if she wanted coffee when he brewed a pot, even made a dry joke about her secret snack stash in the pantry. None of it was dramatic, but it was movement, and after the months they'd had, movement was everything. One evening, as they sat on the back porch watching the sky turn pink, Megan caught him looking at her. "What?" she asked, smiling without meaning to. He shrugged. "You've been in a good mood lately. It's nice." The comment caught her off guard. It had been years since he'd said something positive about her mood. She didn't think of herself as a bad mood person, but she couldn't deny that lately she'd been quicker to sigh, quicker to point out what was wrong. Hearing him say it, seeing that it had registered, made her chest feel lighter. She realized then that these small changes weren't just making Daniel more willing to engage. They were making her feel better, too. She'd thought of respect and appreciation as something you gave when the other person deserved it. But maybe it was the other way around. Maybe you offered them first, and in return you got more of the behavior you wanted. That's the thing most couples don't realize. Respect and appreciation aren't rewards for good behavior. They're investments. Every thank you, every "I'd love it if," Every moment you let go of correcting something minor, it's like putting emotional credit in the bank. Over time, those small deposits add up to a balance of goodwill, and goodwill makes it easier to weather the harder days. Positive reinforcement works in relationships much the same way it works anywhere else. When someone feels noticed for the things they're doing right, they're more likely to keep doing them. It's not manipulation, it's human nature. We move toward the environments where we feel valued and pull away from the ones where we feel constantly measured and found lacking. Megan still had her doubts, moments when she wanted to slip back into old habits, when it felt easier to point out what was missing than to acknowledge what was there. But each time she held back and chose to frame something as a request rather than a demand, she noticed that Daniel responded faster, less resistance. He seemed more willing to participate in the daily rhythms of their life. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heaviness in the air between them began to lift. It wasn't a transformation. It was too early for that, but it was enough to keep her going. Enough to make her think that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to keep living the way they had been. About 3 weeks into making those quiet adjustments, Megan walked into the living room one Saturday morning and stopped in her tracks. Daniel was crouched by the wall, a screwdriver in hand, tightening the brackets on the old bookshelf that had been leaning forward for months. She remembered mentioning it once in passing. Something like, "One of these days, that thing's going to collapse," and then letting it go. No reminders, no hints, no sighs when she dusted around it. She certainly hadn't brought it up lately. And yet, here he was, fixing it without being asked. The sight caught her off guard, like catching a glimpse of a part of him she'd forgotten. "Hey," she said slowly. "You're fixing the shelf." "Yeah," he replied without looking up. Figured it was time before it fell on somebody. She felt an unexpected surge of gratitude, mixed with something else, guilt. How many times had he done something like this in his own way, quietly, without fanfare, while she was too busy noticing what hadn't been done? In that moment, Megan realized she'd been keeping score in the wrong direction. She'd been tallying missed chances, forgotten chores, half-finished projects. But she'd rarely counted the things he did, the small acts that didn't always look the way she thought they should, but still carried effort and intention. The lawn mowed before the weekend barbecue. The oil changes on her car without her asking. The way he always made sure her phone charger was plugged in on her side of the bed. It wasn't that he didn't try, it was that his efforts didn't always match her expectations, and she'd been quick to overlook them because of that. Later that day, she found herself replaying old moments in a new light. Like the time he'd stayed late at work to fix a last-minute problem for a client. She'd been irritated he missed dinner, but she hadn't thought about the pride he took in being reliable. Or the weekend he spent replacing a section of the fence. She'd been annoyed at the mess he left in the yard, without noticing the hours he'd put in under the hot sun. They started having little conversations again, not about their relationship, but about everyday things. Daniel came in one evening talking about the neighbor's new dog, mimicking the way it yelped at the mailman until Megan laughed. She told him about a bizarre news story she'd read, and they traded theories about it while washing dishes. It wasn't deep, it wasn't life-changing, but it was easy. And after months of tense silences, that ease felt like fresh air. The heaviness that had been weighing down their interactions seemed lighter, not gone but no longer suffocating. Sometimes she'd catch him looking at her in that slightly curious way, like he was noticing a shift but hadn't decided whether to mention it. One Wednesday night, Daniel came into the kitchen while Megan was packing up leftovers. "Hey," he said, leaning on the counter. "You want to go to Pete's Diner on Friday?" She looked up, almost sure she'd misheard. "Pete's. We haven't been there in years," he finished for her. "I was thinking, maybe we could." Her mind jumped back to the early days of their dating, when late-night runs to Pete's for pancakes and coffee were a kind of ritual. Back then, they'd talk for hours in the corner booth, the hum of the jukebox in the background. The thought of going back made her feel something warm in her chest, a flicker of what she thought had burned out. "Yeah," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "I'd like that." When Friday came, they slid into that same cracked vinyl booth. The waitress, A woman who'd been working there since before they met, greeted them like no time had passed. Daniel ordered the short stack with extra butter. Megan went for blueberry pancakes. They talked about work, about a friend who'd just moved to Arizona, about whether they should finally replace the couch. It wasn't some movie moment of pouring out their souls, but it was comfortable, familiar. At one point, he made a joke about the diner's famous coffee, tasting exactly the same as it always had, burnt, and she laughed so hard she nearly spilled her syrup. Sitting there, Megan felt something she hadn't in a long time, the sense that they were on the same team, that maybe all those years ago she'd chosen right. It wasn't a dramatic turning point, but it was proof that the warmth could still be there, waiting under the layers of frustration. Here's the result of what psychologists call the spouse-fulfilling prophecy. When you focus on your partner's strengths, speak to the version of them you want to see, you invite more of that version to show up. If you talk to them like they're lazy or indifferent, they're more likely to live down to that expectation. If you treat them like they're capable, thoughtful, and willing, you create space for them to rise to it. That doesn't mean ignoring problems or pretending everything's fine. It means choosing which parts of your partner you want to water, knowing those are the ones that will grow. Megan had spent a long time watering the weeds, pointing out the misses, the mistakes, the not quites. Shifting her focus didn't change Daniel overnight, but it changed the environment between them. And in that environment, the better parts of both of them had more room to breathe. When they left the diner that night, the air outside was cool, carrying the faint smell of rain. Daniel reached for the door of the truck and glanced over at her. "We should do this more often," he said. She smiled, and for once, she didn't overthink it. "Yeah, we should." It was a mild Sunday morning, the kind that made you want to linger outside before the day got busy. Megan sat on the porch with a cup of tea, legs tucked under her, watching the steam curl into the air. Out in the driveway, Daniel was bent over the open hood of his truck, wiping his hands on a rag and humming faintly to whatever song was playing on the radio inside the cab. She could smell the faint tang of motor oil, mixed with the cool breeze that carried in the scent of early spring. She thought back to that night months ago, the slammed door, the heavy silence, the way she'd stared at the ceiling wondering if they had anything left to save. If someone had told her then that she'd be sitting here now, feeling a quiet contentment instead of dread, she wouldn't have believed it. Life wasn't perfect, not even close. They still bickered sometimes, about the electric bill, about who forgot to take the trash out, about the never-ending question of what to eat for dinner. But the difference was, those little arguments no longer stuck to them like they used to. They didn't turn into cold shoulders or 3 days of avoiding eye contact. They came and went, leaving room for everything else to take up space again. Megan had noticed changes in herself that felt almost as surprising as the changes in Daniel. If he forgot something, she didn't pounce on it right away. She let it be, sometimes even shrugging it off entirely. She'd realized how much lighter life felt when she didn't treat every mistake like an offense. She'd also learned to focus more on her own happiness. That didn't mean ignoring the relationship, but rather not making Daniel the sole source of her good mood. She started taking walks after work, reading again, even calling old friends she'd lost touch with. She didn't wait for him to fill the silence. She found ways to fill it herself. And somehow, that shift made it easier for him to step into conversations and activities without feeling pressured. Daniel was still him, still a man of few words at times, but there was a new warmth in how he interacted with her. He reached for her hand when they walked down the driveway together. He leaned in to kiss her when he left for work. He'd even started texting her little things during the day, a photo of something funny at the job site, a reminder that he'd pick up milk, a quick, "How's your day?" One evening, they were sitting on the couch, the dog curled up between them, when Megan's sister, Allison, dropped by. She plopped into the armchair with a soda and looked between them. "You two seem really good together," she said, almost casually. Megan glanced at Daniel, who was busy flipping through television channels, and then back at Allison. "Yeah," she said with a small smile. "We are." But inside, she knew exactly why it felt that way now. It wasn't because Daniel had suddenly transformed into someone else, or because they'd solved every problem. It was because she had stopped making her happiness conditional on him changing. She'd started changing the way she treated him, and that shift had altered the entire rhythm of their marriage. There's a truth in relationships that's easy to forget when you're frustrated. The real power to create change often lies in one person deciding to approach things differently. It's not about controlling the other person. It's about controlling your own tone, your own reactions, your own focus. Control feels safe, but connection is what actually nourishes a marriage. When Megan began focusing on connection, through appreciation, respect, and letting go of the need to micromanage, Daniel began meeting her there. He didn't have to fight through layers of criticism to get to her. He could simply show up, in his own way, and know it would be received instead of dissected. It didn't happen overnight. There were days she slipped back into old habits, where a sharp remark escaped her before she could catch it. But each time, she tried to repair the moment instead of letting it spiral. A simple, sorry, that came out wrong, went a long way in keeping the air clear between them. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they built a new pattern. The laughter returned first, in small bursts, then in longer stretches. The physical closeness followed, shoulders brushing while they worked side by side in the yard, his hand at the small of her back when they walked into a store. Sitting there on the porch, watching him work on the truck, Megan thought about how many nights she'd spent waiting for him to change, waiting for him to notice what she needed, to step up in the ways she thought he should. She hadn't realized how much energy she'd wasted trying to steer him instead of steering herself. Now, she understood something simple but powerful. If you want a different dynamic, you have to stop feeding the one you don't want. That meant talking to the Daniel she wanted to see, not the one she feared he was becoming. It meant acknowledging his efforts, even if they didn't come wrapped exactly the way she'd imagined. It meant choosing connection over control, again and again. When Daniel straightened up from the truck and caught her watching, he grinned. "What?" he asked, wiping his hands on the rag. "Nothing," she said, but her smile lingered. And really, it wasn't nothing. It was everything. The kind of quiet contentment that comes from knowing you've both weathered the hard seasons and still found your way back to each other. Because in the end, lasting change doesn't come from waiting for your partner to transform into someone else. It comes from realizing the only person you can control is yourself, and from having the courage to lead with the behavior you want to see. Megan had learned that when you make that shift, you don't just change the tone of your marriage, you change the entire story.